Okay, let's see. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is week 5. Things are moving along, picking up steam. We are on chapter 4 called affordances. And let me go ahead and share my, the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to do something a little bit different because the PowerPoint presentation is kind of light, and I did want to reference some of the actual content in the book. So I hope you have the book available, and if not, that's okay. But what I would recommend is I'll make reference to some of the, some of the chapters some of the sections in the book, and I will call out the page numbers so that at least you can go back and take a look at it, because I think the book gets into a little bit more detail, and we can talk about it, as opposed to the slide presentation is pretty light. And I did want to point out some specific sections, in this particular chapter. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, can you all see this? This is the computer-mediated communications approaches and perspectives, and this is the 4th chapter called affordances. And I'm hoping that you guys kind of, read through it, skimmed through it. It's, in my opinion, it's a little bit not esoteric, but it's a little different from the first 3 chapters that we talked about. When we looked at richness, we can sort of quantify what richness is. And then we looked at something called, what was the second? Media naturalness, how natural is the environment. And then the third one was on synchronicity. And that's basically the timing of the interaction, on computer-mediated communications, whether it's email or text or whatever. And this one is called affordances. So it's a little more subtle, because and this is my kind of interpretation of what affordances is what is the environment, for that social media tool that you're using? What does it afford you? What does it afford you to do? And it goes and explains a little bit about, what is it that these environments enable you to actually accomplish. And I think it's important that they make a differentiation between, an actual affordance and a perception. You might interpret it to be an affordance, but it's not really an affordance. So that subtlety makes it a little bit more, subjective in terms of what is an actual affordance, in some of these computer-mediated environments. And so what I wanted to do was kind of take a look at this first part of the chapter. And it actually talks about affordances, in kind of a natural environment. And I think this is a good kind of analogy or comparison to what exactly is an affordance. So let me ask you, have any of you watched the program called Alone? And maybe just give me a thumbs up, or maybe in the chat just say yes or no. And this is a program called Alone, and it was I think there's a bunch of them, and it's a series that's on the History Channel. Anybody? No, no. Okay. Quentin says yes. So most of you looks like have not seen it. If you do get a chance, you don't have to watch the whole thing, but it's kind of interesting. It's the first thing I thought about when they started to talk about affordances in a natural environment. So the premise of the program is about being dropped into a pretty remote wilderness, and you're pretty much all by yourself. And the whole show is based on the fact that there's 10 people, but they're all placed in different places. Could be, like 5 miles away, 10 miles away, 20 miles away. So you don't really interact with anybody. So you're basically alone. And the whole premise of the show is how long can you last out there by yourself. And it's an interesting watch because it really gets into the kind of like the psychology of survival. But the basic, I guess, analogy that I wanted to draw upon, in terms of this subject called affordances, is that in the natural environment, it says here in this particular section on page 60, affordances in natural environment. It's like an environment provides a potential for safety and food, but the animal must find safe places to hide and locate an adequate food supply. In other words, the animal must actualize the potential of the environment through its behaviors. And, any kind of situation like that where you're alone and you have to survive, there's some real basic things that you have to do. You have to, shelter, food, and water. And the relationship that you have with the environment is the affordance. That's the affordance. So does the land or the environment afford you with food? Does it afford you with water? Does it afford you with shelter? So everything is there, but you have to kind of put it together. And I like I said, I thought that was pretty much kind of the first thing that came to my mind when talking about these affordances. What is the environment? What does a natural environment enable you to do? It still is up to you to figure out how to actually build a shelter or hunt for food or go, fish and catch food. But, it is a natural affordance of that environment. So I bring this up because that's kind of what you have to think about when translating what does affordances mean when talking about these computer-mediated environments. So, and again, these slides kind of give you high level, what they're referring to. The features perceived and used by the participant, and it may not be something that you are, aware of. It might be something that you have to develop an awareness of. And of course, there's this idea of reciprocity. Like once you use it, you gain some value from it. So I guess like in the natural environment example, affordance is like food. I mean, there is food, but you have to figure out a way to capture or get the food. But the reciprocal relationship is now you have some nourishment. And the show the show alone kind of really exemplifies the dependence on food, because if you start thinking about how long could you last if you didn't eat protein? I mean, you can last pretty long if you just drink water, but you still need protein to have your brain function properly. So it really does have this sort of overall effect on your physical being. Another relationship is it depends on experience and expertise. So it's kind of, again, this analogy is a good one because the people that participated in this show alone, they had to have a pretty high degree of sort of like the survival and survivalist skill. So one of the key things is, can you even make a fire? And again, that's a skill that, not everybody necessarily, has, especially if you don't have matches, right? And I guess the key point here is that, over time, as you develop some of the skill, for the folks that were living in this, well, they already had skills that enabled them to survive, but, to do this over a period of time, and I think the seasons that I watched, I think they went maybe 60 plus days, and that was that's pretty long. But they have to develop some skill in determining what could they do to actually survive over that period of time, and a lot of it was kind of mental. But anyway, so this is a kind of a good example translating from the natural environment into this computer mediated environment. Okay. So, this intersection, of what the medium enables, and then there's the constraints, and then there's this intersection of affordances. And so this chapter will get into some of these, what is it that the particular medium affords you as a user to be able to communicate. Okay, so then in this next section, let me see what this next slide shows. So this is the part that is kind of interesting because affordances don't necessarily just present themselves. It's really kind of a subjective. It's not really, well, it's not subjective. It is something clear, and we'll get into some examples of what they are. But there are some perceptions that may cloud whether that affordance is actually a benefit, and how do you actually use it. So not all perceptions are affordances. And one example that they draw or bring attention to is the idea of anonymity. And you may perceive to be anonymous, but it's not really something that particular platform like Facebook provides. So it's a perception, but it's not really an affordance. It's not part of the environment. So participants may have a false perception of the medium, and participants may not perceive that this hidden potential. Another example that they drew upon, and how many of you use or used Snapchat? And maybe just in the chat, just say yes or no. Have you used Snapchat? Okay, so good. There's a fair amount of you that have used Snapchat. And the affordance about Snapchat is that it became popular because people didn't necessarily want to have their stuff up there forever. And so Snapchat provided the environment where you could post something and then it disappears, in a given amount of time. And that's, kind of like a inherent nature of Snapchat. And that is considered an affordance. So that's the difference between a perception and then an actual environment that, in this case, Snapchat provided. So I think you probably remember that when Facebook and Instagram, they're all pretty permanent. Like once you put something up there, it's pretty much there. And then Snapchat came along, and a lot of people would like the idea that it was just kind of a temporary thing. And then I think it was Facebook wanted to acquire Snapchat because they saw how they were sort of stealing part of that whole market share. And then Snapchat said they weren't going to sell, and then I think that's when Facebook, I think maybe Instagram started their own kind of like stories, and then stories. Oh yeah, I think it was stories, and then that was kind of a temporary thing. So they pretty much competed directly with Snapchat. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. Okay, now this next slide, I don't know. I think this is kind of maybe inaccurate in terms of like not a complete slide, so we can sort of skip over it. But I think the more complete example is on page 62, where there's a diagram that shows, sort of this environmental potential, the environmental constraints, and then on the right-hand side, you have these perceived potential, perceived constraints, and then they divide the circle with affordance, these false perceptions, hidden potentials, and the hidden potential can be something that you may not be aware of, and maybe over time you become more aware of that particular, let's say, feature of the environment, and then you can better leverage that, and it becomes an affordance. And then you have these sort of, media constraints. So that this diagram on page 62 is a little bit more complete than the one that I just showed on slide 5. Okay, so then now we kind of move into this 3 criteria for affordances. So, not a characteristic of the medium. Affordances change with perception and use of the medium. So, if you look at, starts on page 62 and then goes to 63, it starts off by saying that the first criteria, an affordance is not a characteristic or a feature of the medium. The technological features of a medium do not change. So affordances, it change with the participant's perception and use of the medium. So again, your experience with using the medium brings more, I guess, value to that affordance. A second criteria says affordances do not describe communication outcomes. So an affordance might make a possible, an outcome possible, but it's not the same as an outcome and can facilitate a variety of outcomes. Okay, and then a third one is an affordance is not a binary opposition, but a variable potential. So as you can see, it's kind of a very sort of subjective and subtle thing about what these environments enable you to do. And it gets a little bit more specific. It talks about, and this is kind of a good way to bring it to something more tangible. Anonymity. This is on page 63. Let's see. So on 63, it says anonymity is the degree to which a source is unknown or unspecified. So in some of the, let's say, social media environments where, like in Facebook, as well as Twitter or X, you can get verified. You get a verified account. And nowadays with X, you got to pay for it. So it's, and I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk, but uh, the verified process sort of verifies that you are who you claim to be. But then there's the ability to sign up for either of those social media accounts. You can put for whatever whatever you desire. Name could be a fake name, could be a pseudonym. You could choose, whatever gender you want. You could choose whatever age you want. There's no real penalty for choosing whatever you decide to choose. So from an anonymity standpoint, it doesn't necessarily associate itself directly with you. So what does that do? That creates this environment where you can pretty much say whatever you want to say and not necessarily be held responsible for saying that. So then, the outcomes as a result of that can change. So, that's an example of how anonymity, is this environment where you can have the ability to be anonymous, and it creates, a variety of different forms of outcomes depending on how you want to choose to, I guess, behave, in that environment. Another one, also on 63, is this idea of persistence. And persistence is, and we talked about it in some of the other, media examples, but it's the ability to describe the extent to which communication remains accessible after its original presentation. So, for the longest time, Twitter would not enable any editing. So whatever you put into that particular post, and that's why I think there's a lot of value in being able to edit, or proofread your post before sending it out. You could not edit it after it was actually posted. The only thing you could do is delete it. And so, again, that's an environment that's kind of an affordance. And then you have to learn what's the best way to manage that kind of a situation. And I think for the longest time, you could just delete and then move on, or repost it, with the correct, whatever you wanted to say in that particular post. Whereas places like Instagram and Facebook, you could actually go in and edit. So anyway, persistence is that feature where whatever you put out there, doesn't change once you're posting it. And then the third one is visibility. Recognizes the ease with which one can find information. So visibility, is another, it's an affordance, but when you think about how visible is, let's say, post in Facebook. If you wanted to actually find somebody's post, you remember seeing it, and maybe you don't even remember who actually posted it, but you wanted to find, it was something that you wanted to search for and see if you could find it. Some of these environments really don't make it easy for you to find something. unlike Google, where you can do a Google search and you can find whatever's on the web. But if you're inside Facebook or if you're inside Instagram, it's hard to find stuff. So again, visibility is another. It's a environment where if it is enabled, it is an affordance, because it is a valuable thing that you could actually find something. Hashtags are a good example of that. They're hashtags um, came about as a result of trying to not only search for stuff, but actually be a part of something, right? So if there's a trending event or occurrence, and it could be captured in a hashtag, that's a way to not only search for posts about it, but it's a way to contribute to that sort of aggregation. Okay, next slide. So 3 characteristics of affordances. They emerge in communication practice. So it takes practice to kind of figure out, like, what does this environment really enable you to do? So that's going to come as a result of practice. It's not gonna be like an obvious thing, once you get on to figure out, like, what are some of these affordances. Well, participants use affordances for computer-mediated communications, and we'll look at some examples of that. And then you have this technological communication and social affordances. And again, these are all subject to the environment that you're in, and they could all interact with each other. So it makes it a little bit more complex, but it is, as we'll find, kind of like fodder for. Let me see what's going on here. Okay, it is fodder for research. So I think this, this section is a little esoteric, but it is sort of fodder for some of the researchers in this area to do a little bit more, kind of studying of these interactions, depending on what kind of computer-mediated communications you're using. So these three kinds of affordances, and this is, let's see, we're looking at page 64. So you have this technology affordance, interaction between technology and communication use. And in the book, it says that technological affordance emerges through the interaction of technology and social culture uses. It refers to an adaptation of the technical characteristics of a medium to a particular communication purpose or goal. And the example that they draw upon is, synchronous audio conferencing may have voice-activated or a facilitator-controlled participant microphone that limit interaction to one person at a time and reduces the possibility of interruptions. So, like we had just now, where not everybody might be on mute, and somebody might come in and either interrupt or inadvertently, sort of draw attention from, me who's speaking, right? So that the technological affordances, the ability to actually mute, the person. So that's basically where communications is controlled by the technology. And I find that, this ability to mute comes in pretty handy, given the situation where you could be on a Zoom call. You might have, like in our case, 30 plus people, and it's you can't force everybody to be on mute. Somebody might not be on mute, and then it could be disruptive if somebody just comes in and has, let's say, another conversation that's going on. So that kind of the ability for the application to enable the ability to mute somebody is kind of a technological affordance. So the next one is communication affordance, interaction between perception of communication potential and use. So then the book kind of further talks about communication affordance, refers to the interaction between a person's perception of the communication potential of the medium and its desired use. So let's see, like a facilitator who strategically turns on a participant microphone on and off to give priority to a particular point of view or to control the flow of discussion in a decision-making group. So again, this is another kind of subtle way of, if, I wanted to, maybe I'll draw upon this example of our broadband HUI, where we may have a subgroup, and a subgroup is focusing in on a particular topic, and we're having a discussion about that. I would encourage, those folks that are in that subgroup to chime in, and that helps to redirect the discussion around that specific topic that is being, for the most part, managed by that subgroup. So that's kind of a communication affordance, and again, it's the environment that enables, a facilitator to kind of control who gets to speak and who doesn't, in a sort of interactive video conferencing kind of environment. The last one here, social affordance, describes the relationship between a person and the medium in a way that changes social practice. And again, this one is, some video conference participants comment that the increased use of business meetings is reducing the hierarchy of the workplace. So social hierarchies, like in a work environment, you may have levels of management, and in levels of management, you typically would go from your direct report rather than going directly to somebody higher up. That's a typical social hierarchy, and it oftentimes exists in the business environment. But then if all the folks that are on a Zoom call, and they're all sort of potentially interacting as peer to peer on a video conference like Zoom call, there's a high likelihood that you're not going to necessarily be required to go the typical sort of hierarchical communication route, because everybody on that call is kind of like peers. So that's kind of an example of interacting on a synchronous video conference that sort of changes the social norm, that if it wasn't there, you may be more inclined to be following sort of that hierarchical business social environment. Okay, next slide here. So it further kind of breaks down these three, sort of topical areas: technology, communication, social, and how it impacts things like message construction, engaging with others, and group communications. So this one, I think, gets discussed starting on page 64. Let's see, I think one of the important points I wanted to point out here is that, this kind of environment where you're forming a message and trying to communicate, participants to resolve misunderstandings or create a set of shared goals, and then in a face-to-face conversation. So at the same time, computer-mediated communications affords the creation of new cues in the form of emojis, acronyms, and other expressions that allow users to express themselves in ways that spill over into the face-to-face interaction. And then you have these other things that we talked about before, like, the editability of a message, rehearsability, and that's, being able to read it, edit it, and then make sure that it clearly communicates what it is that you're talking about. Persistence, these are all sort of things that help to enhance this message construction. And then engaging with others kind of is also, we talked a little bit about how controlling the microphone, makes the environment conducive to the moderator, and how it could, on the one hand, prevent or minimize disruptions, and then on the other hand, try to enhance the voice of others, given kind of the collaborative environment that we're in. And that way, if decisions are needing to be made, you can enhance the voice of others. So it says on 66 talks about triggered attending, which is, how I kind of give you guys an opportunity to maybe respond to a question via the chat. That's kind of triggering a response. You have this thing called meta voicing, and meta voicing describes engaging in the ongoing conversation by commenting on the presence and participation of others. In other words, trying to encourage others to speak to a particular topic, as the conversation unfolds. And then this third area called generative role taking. When a conversation stalls or devolves into divisive dialogue, a participant may step in to offer potential solutions. That's just another way of saying that, in this environment that we're in, you have the potential, and I've encountered this firsthand, where you may not expect a response from somebody to a situation, and you need to be able to either put it to rest or bring it to some conclusion quickly before it kind of disrupts the entire interaction that you're having as a group. So that's kind of that generative role taking, and that's on page 67. Okay, so the next piece, let's see, these next set of slides kind of talk a little bit about how these affordances, might be used, and then we can sort of go through each one of these. So the bandwidth, that's just the ability for you to convey, the kind of information that's needed. It's the amount and kind of cues that are available. The editability, ability to revise the communication message, and we talked a little bit about that. Being able to kind of proofread it before you actually hit send. The rehearsability, ability to rehearse and adjust messages before sending. Persistence, permanence of a message across time. Privacy, visibility, the ability to keep private or make visible to particular audiences. And that's something that you see in things like Instagram, where you can make your Instagram feed public or you can make it private. And if it's private, then you can, in essence, control who it is that you're making it visible to. And then personalization, ability to tailor messages to specific audiences. Engaging with others. Okay, so this previous one was about the message construction, right? And these are the three kind of areas that we just talked about. So now engaging with others, social presence, sense that participants are close to one another, right? So the environment, how does the environment encourage and enhance that ability to know that, we are close to each other? And I guess the example that, that I drew upon in terms of the broadband Hui, we have 40, 50, 60 people that join, and then these subgroups will form. And those participants, over time, and again, this is kind of something that happens over time, will interact with each other and then have a more, let's say, closer affinity to one another. Network association, conversation with broad network, distributed individuals. Again, how do you bring together people? And, even in this class, it's kind of interesting to see, are there some of these coalescing of groups within this class? I'm not sure. Haven't quite seen it, but maybe the class isn't quite as conducive to that, unless I gave you guys an assignment and had to group you into particular projects. Accessibility, communicating across space and time, conversational control, ability to manage CMC interactions, flow of information, kind of the ability to, to mute and unmute folks. Triggered attending, observe online conversations with until the topic of interest. Again, that's an example of asking a question and maybe having you respond via the chat. Meta voicing, comment on presence and participation of others. Meta voicing really is, giving voice to any of you that perhaps wanted to chime in on any of these topics, and giving you a chance to, share that insight. And generative role taking, taking a leadership role, creating productive group dialogue, and again, what's important is being able to kind of maintain a certain code of conduct. In fact, another example is that during this broadband Hui that I conduct, there was one instance where there was a kind of a critical interaction between some of the players that really kind of helped prompt the need for me to publish a code of conduct so that everybody knew, there's a certain way of kind of acting, certain ways of showing respect, for others on the call. So it's good to have those ground rules kind of laid out in any of these kinds of, environments, and more so, with some of these CMCs. Group communication, you have the individual, collective, and shared. So in the individual, ability available to one group member, but not to others. Collective, members using CMC media in specialized complementary ways. And then this shared affordance, all group members having common access to a medium characteristic. So again, it's just giving sort of this environment. How does it benefit an individual, a collective set of members, and a shared group in whatever CMC that you're using? And again, this is across the board, from email to phone conversation to social media. I think it's probably more applicable, in the social media environment, as well as some of this video conferencing like Zoom, like we're doing now. So some of these, as we get into the latter part of the chapter, and this is, applying affordances, this example of saving face. These examples, I think, are a way to bring some sort of real world sense to what these affordances allow us to do. And in this example about, saving face, it kind of goes into, it says over here, an important influence on face saving communication responses is the cultural dimension of individualism dash collectivism. And I'm not going to put too much emphasis on these last few pages because, again, I think this is leading into more potential research that I think academicians might be interested in pursuing, with respect to the social media environments. So they really kind of go into how to correct, misinformation on social media, and talk about the synchronousness of, the medium, these nonverbal cues, and the publicness, private versus public, and how do you reduce the embarrassment. Now, I do want to note that this particular topic on correcting misinformation, we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about it with our guest speaker next week, because she'll give an example of something that occurred that went out pretty widespread, and how does that get sort of corrected. I think she's not going to talk too much necessarily about affordances, but you might be able to draw kind of maybe draw upon stuff we've read about in this chapter, and see if there's elements of what she did to recover, and how the particular environment through affordances enabled that. So that's just something to pay attention to when we have our guest speaker next week. And again, they go on to talk a little bit about, discussion of police shootings, and Facebook affordances influence communication. It says perception of Facebook anonymity. And this is an example of, if you're anonymous, your identity is hidden, so people tend to speak up, whether it's truthful or not. Network of like-minded individuals, perception of persistence, again, anonymity, network, persistence, influence, the choice. So these all have, I would say, not unintended consequences, but they do have consequences as a result of some of this persistence. And again, the rest of I'll kind of end here, because I think the latter part of the chapter kind of gets a little bit more esoteric, and talks about some topics that may, if you're interested, lead to further research in this area. And I guess, because it's sort of subjective, and not it's defined through the gained experience of the participant, and so it's not something that necessarily is black and white, or, like they said, binary. It's something that kind of evolves over a period of time as you grow that experience. And then I think there's probably a lot of room for research, but I think it's a good just chapter to kind of be aware of. But I don't know, unless any of you want to kind of continue on and maybe read some of the sort of recommended readings that might lead you down a path of further research, that's more than welcome. But again, unlike the first three chapters about richness, naturalness, and synchronicity, this is a little bit more, I think, open to, it's more subjective and more not necessarily clearly definable, because it really is dependent on a number of different things. Any questions at this point? I know it was kind of this is probably the most esoteric chapter that we've encountered so far. Any comments, thoughts? Confusing, clear? What's your guys' feeling? Don't be shy. I see one thumbs up. Okay, well, if you guys are okay with the topic, that's great. Again, it's a little more esoteric than the previous ones, but it is a subject for further research. And I think, as you notice, this book is a good example of how you might want to break down some of the different tools and look at it from an analytic standpoint. And then as you get into more research on the topic, I can see where affordances might be a rich area for some research. And again, some of the examples are, they're pretty easy to understand, but how do you start to quantify the impact of, let's say, anonymity? Or how do you quantify the impact of, misinformation? How do you quantify the impact of, being able to turn somebody's mic on and off, on or off? I don't necessarily have the answer to that, but I'm sure if you try to put some quantitative value to, those actions, you could probably come up with an interesting paper as a result of that. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Again, our speaker for Thursday might have a good example of how to fight or how to deal with some not misinformation, but sending something out that might have been better managed, or I think it's rehearsability, before actually hitting send. So we'll look at that. And then don't forget, if you have any issue, and I guess Madeline, if you want to shoot me an email, I'll go look and see if you have any problem with Cognella. Again, it's the you have to have access to that link, active.cognella.com, and I haven't seen any indications from any of you that you've got a problem. So, but if you do, please let me know, and then we can get it resolved. But that's where the quizzes are. So after this class, you can check out the quizzes, and then on Thursday we'll have the guest speaker. So until then, thanks for joining, and we'll see you on Thursday. Aloha, aloha, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.